Welcome back to another episode of today's Premier Experts. I'm your host, Ray Perez, and today my special guest is New York Times best-selling author, Benji Rabbhan. Welcome to the show, Benji.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here, man. I am super excited for you to be on the show because I've had the opportunity to attend some of your events and learn about some of your companies, and I just can't wait for you to share with them. But before we get into that, can you share a little bit of how you got started?
How I got started? Well, I've been doing this since I was 11 years old. I've been an entrepreneur for my whole life, pretty much. I had a grandfather who was, he's still alive today, 97 today. And when I was little, he was an entrepreneur, and he sort of inherited the entrepreneurial traits. And I could tell that his brain was a little bit more like my brain compared to everyone else in my family. And so I just listened, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, just listening, every time we would go there for Thanksgiving or something like that. And so one day I realized when I was around 11, I was like, I really want access to this whole new technology thing we're talking about in the 90s, right? So mid-90s at this point. So I would love to have a computer. But we didn't have that, and I didn't have my own computer, obviously. And so the only way I was going to get something like that was to create it functionally. So what did I do? Well, I realized maybe I could sell something or create some sort of a business, right? Which at that point is like, is a business really a business? I'm 11, right? But I came up with a company named Silver Wizard Incorporated, right? The 11-year-old name, right?
Wow.
And I started selling website development services and built websites for people on the school computer. And then very soon I had enough money to buy the parts, and I built my first computer.
Wow.
And then the next thing you know, I'm literally setting up all of the computers, like all of the labs for the entire county of my school system. I had a whole team of little 13-year-olds running around, like leaving class all day, all the time. I barely went to middle school and elementary school for that exact reason. I had a whole IT business, kind of like a Geek Squad, like kind of a thing, but before Geek Squad even was a thing. And so I was the first person in our neighborhood I literally petitioned to get broadband internet brought to our neighborhood, and I was the first person in the neighborhood to have it.
At what age?
I was probably 13 or 12 at the time, at that point. And so I didn't have actual cash exchanges until I was 13, but it was always like trade. It was like, I'll build your website if you buy me this hard drive. Take me to this CompuServe store and buy me this hard drive or whatever. I was like, or I need this program called Flash to do an e-commerce site, or whatever it was, right? Buy me this case, it's this much money. And then I'd go, and I made friends with like a local, like professional IT company, and he kind of showed me the ropes and mentored me and stuff like that. Right next to my karate gym, right? It was the computer, but I walked in, just no fear, just walk right in. And next thing you know, I have all this stuff. My family was, they are very supportive today, but they were not the most supportive at the time because they just wanted me to be in school. They wanted me to go through the traditional
traditional.
Right, and that followed all the way through college, that they wanted that. So I gave them all of it. Meanwhile, I had probably 15 businesses between 13 through college at that point.
So you finished college for the family?
It took me 7 years to do undergrad, just for the whole purpose of saying, Dad, I got the degree that you wanted, and I also separately got the degree I wanted, which is having 5 businesses simultaneously while getting the degree, right? Wow. And so it was never about the money in the early days, and I would say even now it's starting to be a little bit more about wealth building, of course. But
because you have a family now.
Because I have a family now, right?
It's different.
It's different. So, but it's always been about the means to the end of getting the cool thing that I could use to learn the next thing, right? So oftentimes the businesses that I would create would be to follow the interest area that I couldn't find the information for. So I was sort of unintentionally inventing or innovating, right? But I was really just trying to figure out, how does this thing work? Why do people do this? What's the best way to do this? Wait, how could you do this better? And then to experiment, to learn, to grow, I actually needed to have equipment. So I would sell something to then buy the equipment, to be able to sell more of something with that equipment, to then do the next thing, to the next thing. And so all the business, and I rolled all the money from that whatever business into the next business, into the next business. So it's always just been about learning all the way up until having kids.
So by the time you graduated college, got the degree, thanks mom and dad, here you go, how many businesses had you had by that time?
I mean, by the end of the degree, it was at least 15. I remember specifically people asking me that back then and me saying, I don't count anymore. And the reason for that was because So at that point in time, I had 5 active businesses that were all doing 7 figures or more by that point. And so,
And the age of what?
let's see, so I would have been 24, 23, something like that, right? 25 or 25, somewhere in that range.
5
so
businesses,
my
25 years old,
yeah,
breaking 7 figures.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
But they were all, literally, I didn't take any of the money home. It was literally all to reinvest into the next business, right? So business number 5 was paying for business number 1, right? Right? Or business number 5 was paying for the education that I needed, the real education, meaning like the hands on the ground, not the like go to school, do courses, books. That's not how my brain works. Some people's brains work that way, and I totally respect and I'm a little jealous of that. My brain only works by doing the actual thing, building something, experimenting with something, and usually innovating with something to keep my interest, right? Then I get to a point where I sort of get it as good as I possibly can, build that expertise as much as possible, and then try to ride it out as long as I can until I historically would have lost interest until I learned how to not lose interest, right? But I would lose the interest and I'd create another business and try to put the other one on autopilot as I was transitioning. And that was the way. Or I would shut it down and take the lesson. You know, I'd say, this is a failure because of X, Y, and Z. Even if it's profiting, it doesn't matter. This is a failure because it's, this. It's a partner issue or a structural issue or an infrastructure or too soon for its time. Whatever it was, whether it was profiting or not, I would still call it a failure. And then I would take that failure and then roll that into the next thing and be like, honestly, I would hardline it a little too much. I would say, this is a failure. I'll never do this again, without the nuance that I later learned that you can't. Sometimes that conclusion's a little bit too intense, whatever it was in the early days. Like conclusions of age 18 are different than what I would say now about those same things.
So obviously, you're very intelligent, you're very driven, very hardworking, had multiple businesses for a very young age, very successful in that space. But you also had challenges growing up, which ended up leading to one of your companies now. Can you kind of share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I had a lot of challenges, I would say. One thing I learned, I kind of mentioned my grandfather earlier. One thing I learned was that my brain was fairly atypical. I didn't see it as, like you say, all the things, smart, whatever you just said, right? I couldn't even hear it. My brain can't even hear it because all I hear is different when I hear that stuff, right? And so my brain, one of the qualities of it is I don't actually even want to be different. I just want to be like everybody else. I want to connect with everyone, right? I'm the hugger. I want to just literally, whatever we can do to be deeper friendship, right? That's my motivation in life. It's always, how can we help each other? How can I help you more than anything? Because I just want to have a deep connection, right? And it's all for the hug. That's the selfish part. I want the other side of the hug, right? And the relationship. And so for me, I didn't have that clarity about that when I was a kid, right? When I was really young. And when you're young and you're different, and your brain's different, and I'm like, what 11-year-old is, literally being called out by the head of the county to fix a computer at a different school? Right?
Not.
No one. So there were some teachers who were like, really like, oh, this kid's cool and whatever. And I would say now, my language is, they were projecting positive traits onto me. And there were some teachers who were like, no, this is not fair. This isn't okay. This is bad for him. And they would
because you weren't in school, you were out doing other things.
School, when I look back at them now, I'm like, they're both right, right? Yeah. Like that's dangerous, right? What if, who knows? Like I always say, my brain type, I could have gone one direction or the other, super successful or homeless, right? And so because I did find I had those good mentors who did support me through that, and frankly, the kind of haters, right? Those haters were, I didn't really have the term hater, and I just was like, why are they saying these things, right? It's just so weird. Meanwhile, I'm looking at life from a different lens and trying to understand, like, why doesn't everyone just want to hug everyone all the time? Why doesn't everyone just want to be friends? Why is there like these like hidden agendas and things? I don't really understand what's happening in this interaction with someone, right? And so, it's like, or why would something go so well with someone and then all of a sudden it's not going to go well, right? And I think it happens to everyone. We all kind of have this thought, but the difference is that my brain doesn't like to not figure stuff out. So I like the longest lasting sort of experiment series of question marks for me was, what is actually freaking happening here, right? What is happening? Why is it that people literally will be friends, best friends, right? For years, right? Like my grandfather and his sister, best friends, they're great friends for most of their life. In their 80s, they never talk to each other again, or whatever it was, 70s, right? And it's like, so they end their lives estranged, right? What's that about? How is that possible that something could just, right? Like how could anything be that important, right? And so I was always obsessed with that question. Meanwhile, in all these businesses, there's one common trait. What's a common trait in every business? People. It's very hard to create a business without people, and I wouldn't want to, because that's very boring, right? It goes against my own natural motivations, right? So what's the constant challenge in all businesses, across all industries, across all needs, across all things? People challenges, right? And so there started to be sort of trends and themes and all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of part of what led me to where we are in this day.
So let's fast forward to today and let's talk about the company that was created through this inquiry that you had and through the challenges you had, quite frankly, in your life that got you really studying people, studying the brain and how people think and why they think this way, why they act this way, which has led you to one of the companies that you have now, right?
Yeah, totally. So I would say that in an early entrepreneurial journey, I'm in my 20s, and the motivation to get things done and accomplish things and get outcomes in the business was much higher than worrying about what everyone thinks, right? That being said, I still cared a lot about people, so I did want to have my friends and be liked and that kind of stuff, right? But it just wasn't a major focus. As I got older, I got married, right? I started having kids. I was like, I really, what I want the most is partnership, right? I want business partners. I'm sure of it now. I've had a lot of business partnerships and a lot of solo businesses where I own the whole thing, right? And it's just more fun when you got someone to share it with, right? That's my thing. I owned it, right? And so I made some attempts at sort of doing this experiment, having apprentices, having business partners in my mature life. And what I realized through it is, what I need is balance. I need someone who will be almost my opposite. Now, what I didn't realize was that I was sentencing myself to both the biggest traumas and also the biggest sort of amazing epiphanies later after the traumas, right? Because if you are literally interacting with the opposite brain of your brain, you are speaking a different language. Yeah. You could both be speaking English, but if you can't see or understand each other's perspective, you might as well be speaking two completely different languages. I might as well be speaking Mandarin, and they might as well be speaking English, because we're going to be judging body language, and that's basically it, and everything else is a projection. Got it. Right? Yeah. And so I didn't realize, and neither did the other people in this early phase, right, what was happening there. So, we'll call it 85, 90% of employment experiences or partner experiences were positive or neutral, right? But those couple, that hit hard, right? Yeah. It's like
we all have them.
We all have them. We've all had it, right? With those breakups in your personal life, whatever it is, all relationship stuff. Yeah. It's like you still sit there and wonder, and so part of your brain wants to kind of conclude something so you can move on. Well, the way my brain works, the only way I can conclude and move on is to actually figure out what actually
understand
happened.
It.
True deep understanding, right? True deep understanding to the level that I could actually potentially, there was probably originally motivation to prevent it, right? Because it's trauma for everyone. What's the point, right? But then also to have better discernment, right? And then also to understand how to put people together better for better optimal outcomes, both in business, in personal life, and all these different places, right? So I both married my almost exact opposite, right? In the business that we're doing now, there's an actual system where we map the brain of people, and in it there's 20 different things. My wife and I are 19 out of 20 opposite.
Wow.
19 out of 20 opposite, the most opposite couple in the entire database. So you could ask yourself, spiritually or something like that, why were we attracted to each other? Well, I don't know, but when people say they're opposites, we got a lot of these couples in this database. They're like 6 out of 20 opposite or something, right? 19 out of 20. So I was clearly obsessed with setting myself up, or whatever sets things up for us.
The universe,
right?
Yeah, attracted you.
That was a big thing. But overcoming that, and the same thing in my business life, right? I was attracting my opposites. And it was almost like I was trying to come to this conclusion of what this was. And I was lucky enough to have a mentor who kind of started pointing me in some directions that led to some cool epiphanies about this stuff.
So can we talk a little bit about the business now, and how you guys map people's brains, how you've discovered these nodes of how people connect, where there's similarities, where there are differences, and the benefits that after you've done this process and gone to the training, I've actually been through your training, what's available to you after?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of different parts to it. These days I spend most of my time in one of our businesses that's it's just recruiting focused and hiring focused. We use the brain technology to match people to the perfect role, but more specifically, the perfect role with the right seat, right? So meaning the people around it. So most companies are recruiting, they're just looking at, are you going to be good at that job? no one's going to be good at that job at each company, right? That job is going to be very different at that company as it is at a different company.
Because of the ownership and the people.
The people around you, right? So it's the relationships between the brains of the people around you, right? So we can use our tech to predict that, and so we have a much higher success rate on that. So I spend most of my time these days on that. But in our other company, the training company, it's kind of my more it's what I enjoy a lot. It's
your passion,
right? In part because I get to make more friends that way as well, right? But the About the Institute is where we do the trainings, and Seat Match is where we do the recruitment and hiring and stuff. But in the Institute, we actually we'll go through and we'll map the brains, right? It's a whole process. We probably don't have time for it to talk about right now. But the idea is we're basically reverse engineering the outputs of someone's neural networks, right? So without going into too much detail, the idea of neural networks, which is something that was commonly known as a term now through artificial intelligence and machine learning. But what people don't realize, even in that field, is it was originally a theory about how the human brain works from psychologists. Over 60, 70 years ago, before we had the technology to test the theory. Right. So in a way, AI and machine learning has gotten to a point with a lot of the cool tools now that can sound a lot like a human, at least in written form. They've at least in part proven that that is close to how the brain works. It's not exactly, right? We can get into that, but it is close. We do have neural networks, right? Both software neural networks and hardware neural networks. So what we're trying to do, and what we actually will do for people, is map the different nodes, the different parts that make up their brain, that actually create the filters, that lead to their personality, that lead to the stories they tell themselves, that lead to the things that they might answer in a questionnaire that they might then believe about themselves, right? It's not their personality, it's the layer below.
It's how the personality is created.
How the personality is created, how their language is created, how their body language is created. We can see this stuff as early as 2 weeks old. Wow. Right? Because a lot of it is genetic propensity based, right? And so we've been able to tie that. One of our other companies is a genetics company. So we've been able to tie some of it, not officially peer reviewed yet, so I'm just giving you early data, right? But there is correlations between some of the genetic propensities and some of the brain node propensities, right? And so it makes sense. Neurotransmitters, you have a certain neurotransmitter, right? Just think of it logically. Certain neurotransmitter that makes you a little bit more nervous. Well, you're gonna have a certain way of processing the information around you through that nervous field or nervous filter or whatever that thing is, right? And so that can kind of, if you put all those complex systems together, those little nodes together, that can pretty highly predict what your personality might look like, or what literally what a debate between two people might sound like, or when even you might fight with someone for the first time and what that fight will sound like from both sides, right? It's a little creepy, to be honest, sometimes, right? And so the biggest thing for us has been protecting what we've learned, what we've created, what we've researched, what we've figured out, but then also protecting it from what it's going to be used for, and then figuring out what's the best way to use it to serve humanity positively, right? And so what's come out of that is mostly hiring, right? Putting people together where the people will love their job and the boss will not have to stress out to teach them the thing, or they'll fit together well, right? To be able to give them that very accurate heads up of if there's any differences between them, to tell them, hey, in 7 months, this is gonna happen, so when it happens, go to this thing and you'll be fine, right? Or whatever it is. So we can preempt a lot of the miscommunication potential that comes, right? And then we do the same thing in a company called Growth HR, which is another subsidiary where we actually will do ongoing. We'll kind of be like the support staff, the psychology support staff, in addition for the team, in addition to doing all of the like paperwork, traditional HR stuff, right? But we're actually like reinventing what human resources means, the human part of it, right? Bringing that back in.
So in the Brain Mapping Institute, you guys are focusing on really supporting people in being a little bit more empathetic, understanding.
Well, yeah. So what was interesting was in the initial, in the early research phase, right? We have the research arm as well, right? And so in the early research phase, we just had these notes. We're like, what if we actually taught the people this, right? In traditional psychology, it's almost like the belief is sort of, it's unspoken belief, but it's you got to be an expert in psychology to understand, to be able to learn psychology. It's kind of what's right, and then there's no harm or malintent behind that. But I was like, what if we actually just taught people this complex system? We've got an actual way to show someone the brain of another person. What if we taught people about other people's brains, and like what would happen? And so we started to experiment with it. We've had a whole bunch of different studies, right? We had the team dynamics, right? We had the couples, we had the the bosses, the business partners, right? Post-divorce couples, right? Because they don't want to talk to each other. So what will happen if you...
Parents and kids.
Parents and kids. So many different applications, right? And we didn't expect them all to have good outcomes. It was really just an experiment, right? It's like part of, I wanted the answer. So let's be honest, this is what it was. I wanted to know what would happen, right? And would it have an outcome? And the outcome was really interesting without ever mentioning things like empathy or acceptance, right? Without ever teaching from a top-down approach what good culture is or whatever. People just start to like cut the bullshit and laugh at themselves and each other. And the cultures shift from the bottom up, whether it's a culture in a company, a culture in a household, a relationship, because we are naturally just projection machines. All of us, without exception. We can think we're the most expert in whatever it is, but even when I want, even with all this knowledge, I will still naturally project. My own brain, my subconscious controls the majority of my whole reality, right? Yeah. My conscious is just this little part of what actually makes me me, right? Most people will feel weird by me saying that because they might feel like they are them and they understand themselves entirely. But it's our actual consciousness we found is a very, very small part of us, right? And so what does that mean? Well, the person talking to you right now isn't even me, right? Even as I'm talking to you, I'm starting to separate my consciousness from the person talking. And I'm like, who the fuck's talking? Excuse me, right? But what we found is that once you teach someone about these other parts of this other person, it's not stuff they've ever heard before because none of these personality tests or any of these things out there have the ability to measure these things because they're self-assessments, right? And we're measuring...
You're basically saying how you operate opposed to how I get to the point of how I operate.
Exactly, and our mapping isn't judgment language. It's literally just measuring what are these filters in your brain, right? And how do you process it? Do you have Windows or do you have DOS or do you have Mac or do you have some sort of 3D Iron Man thing? What kind of pictures do you see in your brain? We can predict that stuff based on the mapping, right? So if you knew that when you're talking to somebody, right? If I knew when I'm talking to you or the fact that I'm being listened to or watched by other people right now, right? If I knew what they are, would I speak and say something in a way where they wouldn't be able to understand it on purpose? No one purposefully, right? If I were to go to, I don't speak Spanish, for this example, I don't speak Spanish. If I go to South America and I go into a small town where they speak 0% English, I meet someone they know literally no English, this is their English, no English and maybe like 5 words. Let's just pretend that I did actually know 80 words in Spanish. Which language were we going to talk in?
Spanish. Oh, no.
Yeah. Spanish, because I know 80 words, they know 5 words in that example, right? Why would we suffer through English if I could speak Spanish?
You wouldn't purposely,
So what we didn't predict was that people that go through the training, that learn about the other brain, they actually want to learn how to speak the language of the other brain. Wow. And even without wanting to emulate, it's what we call it, emulate the other person's brain language, they still understand. So when there's a miscommunication, it's very easy in real time for them to figure out. It's like, oh, right. Oh, yeah. So instead of being like, oh, you don't like me or you're judging me or whatever it is, right? Whatever the projection is, they go, oh, wait, I didn't send that packet of information.
Yeah, your brain operates this way, therefore, and then you understand what.
Exactly, you understand, right? And that changes. I mean, it's very rare that someone comes to that training and they don't just have like a breaking. But it's weird because it's often compared to like doing some sort of like life-altering training, or psychedelic experience or something, right? But we're literally just like, it's like me or another coach or trainer on a whiteboard teaching science, like this new stuff, right? And we go slow, we go one note at a time, and it takes time, right? But it just changes people's entire perception. And what ends up happening, the ultimate result that we didn't expect, is one of our first companies had 300 people we did, and the head of the company came back to me and he goes, Benji, do you realize you guys have like proceduralized empathy? And I was like, proceduralized empathy? Because that's not how my brain talks, right? Like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, you like teach all this stuff, but like everybody in the company now is empathy. We used to be like this, super stiff, culture where it's like no one wants to talk first and whatever, and then now everyone's like making fun of their bosses making, like it's very open, right? Like my favorite was when we first started teaching a team of HR people, and they're just like dying because they're taught to like, it's basically the opposite. It's not on purpose, they're afraid of, there's so much fear in that side of things, legal fear and bias fear and all this. We're literally going past the past what you see and going straight to the brain. And we all as humans have pretty similar brains, hardware-wise, but very different brains, software-wise. You know?
Yeah. So before we wrap up, you've taken this technology, this brain mapping, and you've been able to pull that into one of the most important industries, which is the hiring industry. So that not only can we find a good fit for the position, we can find a good brain for the owner and team to be able to work with. So just briefly, just touch on that.
Yeah, so traditional thought has been, okay, there's a role and there's a function, and that function needs to be filled by a person that can serve that function. But what hasn't really been thought about or looked at quite as much, but it's been attempted in some ways, but not often, is okay, but like the role, it's like, but who are they sitting next to? And who's their boss? And is their boss going to get along with them, right? Like I see all these things all the time of people complaining about their bosses or whatever.
Yeah,
I'm just
like,
like,
the person can have all the skill set, but if they don't get along with the boss.
If they don't get along with their coworkers, with the boss, whatever, right? It's not just getting along. It's about, why do we not get along? Because we're communicating with different brains. That's all. Getting along is really just understanding each other, right? Yeah. Because if your boss is saying something and your brain's different, you're naturally, automatically going to probably project from the only thing you know to be true, which is this is your boss. He's above you in the role or whatever, right? Therefore, he's looking down on me. Therefore, he's an asshole or something like that, right? But the reality is that what's actually happening is he's trying to probably inspire most of the time. Obviously, there are still some real assholes out there, but he's trying to just explain something or inspire or just be neutral and transfer information or ask a question. But he may not realize or she may not realize that the brain is not going to compute, so it's going to feel like a criticism. Yeah. Or it's going to feel like a command, an arrogant statement, or right? And so these projections, when they happen in the workplace, just become judgments, and you kind of hold them to yourself, whether you like to admit it or not. We all have judgments, right? And so, in our early phase, I was like, oh, can we get rid of this thing, this judgment thing? And it's like, no, definitely not. Humans need to judge. They are judgment. That's part of what was given to us. It's part of our genetics. But we can transfer and transmute the judgment into accurate judgment to what's actually happening between you and the other person. Not the story of it or the projection of it based on our own field, our own perception of reality, right? Our own delusion. So what we say often is we're all delusional. Yeah. Just different types of delusion. And we happen to like we like our delusion a lot. So we want the other person to have our delusion. And when they don't have our delusion, then we get a little upset, right? And we would often argue, almost everyone argue that their delusion's more real than the other person's delusion, or better than the other person's delusion. But as we look at these things, it's more the equivalent of you're wearing blue glasses, I'm wearing yellow glasses, we're looking at a yellow thing, arguing what color it is, never once saying it's yellow. Got it. Right? Because we don't have the ability to see the real color, because we can only be one side of the spectrum of these different nodes. Right? We can't be, or we can be somewhere in the middle. We can't be all sides of all things, right? So the best we can do is learn what is it that we're missing. What are our superpowers? What are our kryptonites? How do we find the balance between? And so when we put people in teams, we're looking for both as many things as possible. Finding balance, them getting along, and them still being good at the role, right? Which often doesn't look like the same profile or brain as the person that would just be good at, like, to be the 100% best at that role, because that person who's 100% best at that role will probably get kicked out of that company 3 months into it because they can't communicate. They don't, right.
Well, man, I could keep talking about this with you for hours, and I know you have so many other things, other businesses you have going on, so I'm probably gonna have to invite you back on the show. Thank you. But if our audience wants to connect with you, if they want to learn about the brain mapping company or the hiring or the HR or the genetics company or get a copy of one of your books, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can check me out on social media. I've got a lot of different social media. You can check me out on, you can buy one of my books. They're on Amazon. I got another book called Win-Win Hire coming out soon here. And we have another one coming out after that as well. Honestly, the easiest way to do it is just to go to Benji360.com, Benji360.com. It has all the things on it. You can find me and connect with me that way.
I love it, man. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you. And thank you for joining us on another episode of today's Premier Experts. I'm your host, Ray Perez, reminding you to never leave for tomorrow what you can do today and always stay true to your brand.